Good morning from Seoul. Good evening, America. Welcome to the 60 time chat. I hope you have a warm tea in your hands. This is again tea time chat. We have an exciting topic, a book chat about the new very fascinating book, Buddhist Tourism in Asia by Courtney Bruntz and Brooke Schedneck. And we have the editors here today with us for the chat. And thanks so much for joining us. And I'm a big fan of literature that explores tourist imaginaries of places and people. And would you like to explain what the global and domestic imaginaries of Buddhism that you mentioned in your chapters mean?
The space as a particular place, and really thinking about how tourist expectations shape what is being offered on the ground. Brooke and I, a few weeks ago, were talking about how things recently have changed, and if a site, because of COVID, and if a site is much more concerned about domestic tourism compared to international tourism, that's really affecting the place in a different way currently. And so that's part of what we really wanted to highlight in this book, is that all of these various imaginaries, if it's an international group of individuals that are being drawn to the site, then the branding of the place becomes very different than if it's for specifically domestic Chinese tourists, or if it's in Japan and it's for a particular like young people, to attract young people. So that's something else that we wanted to think about, is that tourist gaze and how important that is as well.
Yeah, it's even more very interesting in this COVID time without international tourists, right? It's really interesting. And I also found it actually most interesting part of your book. There are many interesting parts, was the revitalization of Buddhism through this placemaking, secularization, commodification, all these processes. And yes, especially in tourism studies, there is not much written about this revitalization of Buddhism, religion, or heritage through commodification and secularization. So I thought that discussion was really, really valuable. Do you wanna kind of talk more about this? How do they actually involve in revitalization of Buddhism, and any examples if you like to share?
Yeah, so one thing that we really found, especially in the workshop, is that most of our authors were really looking at how the sacred is being secularized, and not in a way that has often been talked about, especially within religious studies, in terms of it being now not legitimate, right? So that's often what the studies had really kind of pinpointed previously, is that in the process of secularization, all of a sudden the sacred is lost. And so we were very inspired by Ian Reader, and thankfully he was able to contribute in the sense, especially in Japan, right? Because that survival is so contingent upon secularizing, of making Buddhism this worldly tradition. And this is where we were able to think about how economic contexts have really shaped the interactions of Buddhists and visitors. And so one component that's uplifted throughout quite a few chapters is the importance of spaces being part of tourism networks. And that's not a contemporary phenomenon. You have that historically, especially with trade routes. But what we saw contemporarily is that there are new tourism networks that are being created, even because of railways or buses. So there's there's sorts of like logistical items. And so even that's a process of revitalization, of making sure that your temple has easy access to it. That's one thing that has been uplifted, that it's part of a package tour. So we see this a lot in the kind of tourism groups. We saw this especially with the Cambodian groups in India and Sri Lanka, is if it's part of a package tour and your temple is part of that tour, then that helps its revitalization, and it helps it not to prevent it from failing financially. and the thematic component. So True's work really brings us up. I found that especially in China, and then we see that in Japan as well, is part of, you know, various Asian nations embracing kind of more of a capitalistic marketplace has been a rise in tourism. And so thematic tourism in general has been important. So things like ecotourism, right? If your temple can now be part of an ecotourism circuit, you get a new group of Buddhists or individuals, I shouldn't say Buddhists just yet, but individuals that are interested. And so visiting a temple, you're consuming different things, right? You're consuming the imaginary of peace that Brooke was talking about. Maybe you're consuming the imaginary of health or wellness, or ecotourism or cultural heritage. And what's interesting is that it's for survival. So Justin's work talks about competitiveness, that in China especially, there are so many different sites and you have to compete. And so you need to have a bigger Buddha statue than anybody else. And so it's really like this spectacle. And then so great, Matt Mitchell's chapter is about finding love at Buddhist temples in Japan. Just the most brilliant work I have read in a long time, because this is this revitalization. And so then looping back to Brian's chapter, Nichols' chapter, on really looking at commoditization of, should this be questioned? Is this part of Buddhism? And his conclusion is that, yeah, like this is how you spread the Dharma. And so the more individuals that you can have come to the temple, those are potential future Buddhists. And so kind of the concluding point is that this doesn't desacralize a site, but instead it actually universalizes it. And those are all potential Buddhists.
Very interesting. Brooke, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, that was a great discussion of revitalization. And I guess I didn't really think about it that way, but now that I'm teaching Buddhism now, like an overview of Buddhism for undergrads, and I'm like taking a lot of the ideas from this, because it really it shows you that, like, in all these different countries, in all these different contexts, there's all these kind of issues and problems that Buddhists are facing with, you know, not enough money, not enough people coming in, you know, wanting to spread Buddhism more, not, you know, connecting enough with, you know, maintain their relevance and connecting to like modern assumptions as much as they, you know, need to or would like to. So we can see that tourism is like such a great resource for kind of solving some of these modern issues, these modern problems. Like just get a different audience in, like, you know, market or show the temple in a kind of a different way, use a different imaginary, and get some kind of big statue. You know, there's like all these kind of ways to utilize tourism to revitalize, to get some of this, you know, economic money in, to utilize the secular. Like in Buddhist studies, the secular is mostly just about, it's only been analyzed really to do with meditation, but we don't really see it connected to like secular influences, like commodification, like private companies, like things like this. But we see Buddhists utilizing this and, you know, kind of arguing that this is what is necessary to, you know, thrive, to survive, to thrive, and to maintain their relevance today. So tourism is, yeah, I'm convinced tourism is very important for Buddhism.
That's a good quote.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just read a newspaper article a couple of months ago, actually. Cambodian monks are starving without tourists, even domestic tourists, you know, donating food and money. So yeah, without tourism, yeah, they have some trouble there to even run the temples and for survival. Yeah. But it's such a like fresh angle, because lots of social scientists criticizing commodification is bad, especially around religious sites, and tourists are bad. You know, all this negative kind of discussions and discourses, and this is kind of different side, and there are enough actually examples and and effects going on. So that was really interesting to me. And even from like a young local person, even in Korea, like young people don't really care about Buddhism at all here. But we were a Buddhist country for 1700 years, but everybody goes to church, everybody go to shopping, very westernized, landscape here. But when we see Western tourists go to our temples, young people start thinking, oh, maybe Buddhist temples are cool, so it kind of gives us some kind of different perspectives, and it is our heritage. And so I think that's really important, right?
Yeah,
So,
Korea is like so interesting, and we tried to get a chapter from every country, and of course Korea we were really interested in, but we just couldn't.
Next book.
Country. Next time we'll get you on board, Jaeyeon. But we really think of this as a kind of like a starting point that we hope that people can build on for discussing this much further.
Yeah, definitely. And there's so many studies with surveys and quantitative measurements in religious tourism in our field, which is good, but it's good to have a more ethnographic, qualitative studies with more heavy discussions, which I really, really appreciate. Yeah.
Something I was thinking of with that of thinking about the not letting Buddhism be malleable. That's such it's really coming from Orientalism, right? It's a sense of, okay, well, Buddhism needs to be this nicely clean packaged other that looks different than Christianity. And so part of that is allowing it to be fluid. And I asked monks about that when I was doing some research in China about using WeChat to spread Buddhism. And he said, look, young people are on WeChat. Why wouldn't we use it? That seems silly. And so it's more of like really kind of, I applauded our authors really well, because it really seemed like people were just trying to listen and just listen to the folks that they were interviewing and then uplift themes, rather than doing what we're kind of talking here of the sense of, okay, well, Buddhism has to be this way. And that's often then why you see within studies of people criticizing, well, it's not really sacred or spiritual anymore. It's because they want Buddhism to be something in particular.
That's also kind of going back to the imaginaries of Buddhism for some, right? Some people, yeah. I mean, it is, it is fluid. It is changing. That's true.
Yeah, I try to change it every semester when teaching Buddhism, because that's exactly the assumption that my students have. That monks, can have a cell phone. Those kinds of ideas.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything to this discussion? I know I asked questions that I was interested in actually personally. So if you wanted to highlight any other parts of the book, any other.
Well, do any of the participants have any questions?
Anybody has a question? Oh,
yeah. I have a question. I wanted to ask about the tourist industry, and in particular, its impact on Buddhist nuns. Just on my own kind of observations on the field, it seems that it's the monasteries and monks who are benefiting mostly from the revenue and opportunities for networking with tourists. So I would like to hear your firsthand observations and about how the tourist industry is maybe changing nuns' lives in the Buddhist world.
Do you want to talk about China? And I'll talk about China.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I just know about Thailand. I think in the book, the only thing we have is that Matthew True mentions in his chapter on Cambodia I think a precept nun there who is like the one figure who would rather things be silent and not have the tourists around, but not like a representative of any particular view. But in Thailand, I think it's because of the bhikkhunis, the female monks that are not accepted by the Thai Sangha. that you get the Western women coming and supporting them in terms of tourism. Also the domestic, the Thai women who are probably usually more educated, have like PhDs, have top jobs like diplomats. They also come and support the female monks. So they kind of, I think it's good for them because they're in a kind of marginalized position. But of course, the people that are not, don't really consider themselves connected to the mainstream Thai Sangha are very happy to support them, so they can find kind of alliances from the international community and people that are non-mainstream Thai Buddhists.
In China, what I'm seeing is that the tourism industry has both kind of pushed out nunneries, but at the same time could potentially be beneficial to nunneries. So pushed out meaning because you have such a hierarchy with the Buddhist Association of China and it's male dominated, the kind of upper level decision makings regarding religious tourism is all falling within the male monastic line. And so in that sense, the nunneries aren't part of that conversation, but in some ways that's actually been really beneficial, because if you want to go to a very lovely, quiet lunch in places like Chengdu, you go to the nunnery and it's free. And so it's really, if you are looking for an alternative, then that's the alternative. And they have been very welcoming and opening, but it's not going to be the kind of flashy advertisement like you have from the monasteries. So I think the burnout, the temple burnout, and the burnout of a lot of tourists can send more folks to the nunneries.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think that's true, Courtney, that it's like, the kind of imaginary of more pure, the female monks and the nuns, because they don't have that, access to big temples and big tourist capabilities. Renee, did you have a question?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all your work. I guess my biggest one is really how you dealt with different types of tourist groups. And I'm looking at places in Sikkim, and so there's these huge groups of like Bengalis or Indians compared to Bhutanese. And my just being there in observation, they're working in very different spaces even within the monasteries itself. So I was just curious if that was really just observations or if you were able to interview individuals from groups. I just was curious how you navigated that.
Mm-hmm.
Our East Asia studies were kind of more localized to, I suppose, domestic in the sense of like really kind of strictly thinking about Han Chinese specifically, to go to that level, very much so within Chinese studies. And that is actually a part of nuance that it would be nice to have more of those studies that are looking at different kinds of tourists and different kinds of individuals at sites. But really in East Asia, we're having much more of just like, especially in China, of Han Chinese, but that's not the case in South Asia and Southeast Asia. We had a little bit more of that.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to speak to that.
I mean, I just know in my work that what I've done, because I can't, talk to like each different group, because I don't have, the kind of contacts in each group and, different people or language skills necessary always. So I've, been closely connected more with the monks and with the temple. So then I usually am asking them, what are your ideas? What are your observations of these different groups? So in Thailand, they have the monks, the student monks I talked to had very different views of the Western tourists and the Thai people that came in, who some of them, might be domestic tourists, and then the Chinese tourists. And so I kind of look to their observations to understand, their kind of assumptions, and maybe so it's more of like an emic view from the host group rather than looking at the tourists themselves, because that was going to be too much of a difficult project. And I do find that the host country does often have a lot of understanding. Some of it might be stereotypes, but it is based on their observations over many years in this case. And when I was in Ladakh doing a project on Thai tourists, Thai Buddhists tourists who were in Ladakh, and I was actually talking to the Ladakhi, so this isn't just Thai people, I was talking to the Ladakhi travel agents, and they all had very specific understandings of different types of people. Like, okay, the Indian people from India, they usually are like this when they come to our agency, and the Thai people are like this, and then the Korean people are like this, and so they have these kind of different ideas based on the different groups that they encounter. And if you're there long enough, then you can see those assumptions might change, they might grow. Like the student monks, they at first had a kind of negative view of the Chinese, but then they kind of grew and like understood them a little bit more. So if you're there with the host group long enough, then that can I think be more than just stereotypes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Can I ask one other question, or just kind of a comment? So we mentioned about secularizing and maybe how, but really, I think, Courtney, you were saying this about how it's not really perceived to be that way. And in my work at looking at devotion and really looking at Buddhism in Asia as its devotional practice, in my perception and starting to look at this, is that really that a lot of tourists might be perceived to be, devotional performance. Did any one of you experience that kind of description of tourism? I mean, I know with pilgrimages, we would consider that's fairly obvious, but maybe even these other non-pilgrimage tourists might be understood as devotional too.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot in the sense of thinking about embodiment of when you go to a mountain. I'm always at mountains. Maybe you go to a mountain and you don't plan on doing 3 steps, 1 bow, but then you do find yourself doing 3 steps, 1 bow, which is why I've always really disliked this idea of a tourist or a pilgrim, right? Because maybe in that moment you are a pilgrim and all these things. And so I really do, we've never classified in that way of thinking about it in terms of the devotional act, but that makes a lot of sense, and that's really helpful for thinking about what are you embodying and what are you becoming, and thinking about performance theory in terms of ritual. I think that's really helpful, and that would be another really interesting angle, especially with Pan-Asian studies too. That would be really helpful because again, it wouldn't be limited to this particular Buddhist tradition or this geographical region, but rather what's sparking people's like impulse in that moment to really be performative.
Thank you, Renee. Actually, I have a book published last year, edited a book about all this discussion, how there's kind of blurred area between pilgrimage and tourism, and we shouldn't separate out. The whole book is actually about the unofficial kind of pilgrimage, and we discussed about how some tourists are actually more devoted than pilgrims, because some pilgrims stay in 5-star hotel, drink and smoke, and some tourists are really serious about meditation. So we discussed this in an entire book, so I can send you a link.
I would love it.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, it's kind of ongoing discussion, I think, still, right? Because some people are very rigid. There are tourists are not pilgrims, they're not serious, but there some are more serious in these rituals, and they know more about Buddhism than pilgrims, so it's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think beyond the labels of tourism and pilgrims, if you think about performance and you're within different groups, or you're like maybe part of a group and you're in a different country than like maybe the performance, is from the heart, or, from your devotion, but it's also might be an, performance for someone. And so in that case, like who would it be for your group, or for the host group to see, like, what kind of practices you do to show your devotion in different ways, so the performance aspect is really interesting to look at, especially if you're in a site that has multiple different kinds of Buddhists.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we're just hitting the right time. Thank you so much for this question. It was really lively and naturally flowing, and I really liked it. And thanks for your time and participating. And so sorry about the technical issue. I'm in South Korea. It shouldn't happen this way, right?
Yeah, it should be great there.
I know, bad Korean. But thank you so much. And as I said earlier, I know this is a scholarly book, but I think it's really suitable for anyone who's interested in Buddhism, tourism, or in Asia and Asian culture. It was especially the chapter about the love, the meeting at the temple. Yeah. Anybody will enjoy this book. Yeah, especially if you're locked down. Do they have an e-book, electronic book?
Renee says yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because before I got the actual book, I had to use there was an ebook like through my university's library. So.
Oh, okay. So you can access to ebook. Brooke, you wanna show the book cover?
Yeah, it's a picture that Courtney
Really
took,
nice.
right, in China.
Yeah. I was wondering that was China.
Yeah.
Where in China?
Original Buddhist tourism in
Hangzhou. It's at the Linging in Hangzhou.
Okay. So yeah, so they have an ebook too. So I know it's for everyone, graduate students and undergraduate students. Thank you, Brooke. And scholars in religious studies, Asian religions, Asian studies, cultural anthropology, cultural geography, education and tourism studies, or urban planning, like Hiran, right? So this has really wide, broad audience, I think. So it's really good, and it has very multidisciplinary chapters from interdisciplinary researchers. So I hope more people can take advantage of these discussions and book. That's it. Anything to add, anyone?
Thank you,
Thank
Jaeyeon,
you.
for your promotion and for the great questions from our audience.
Thank you so
Sure.
much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.